Trump raises steel and aluminum tariffs to 50%. Canada vows strategic response. Reuters, June 2025. Canada chokes steel exports. Detroit's auto industry starts gasping for air. The Guardian, August 2025. The White House expected a fight. What it got was a pivot. Instead of punching back, Canada simply turned off the tap, rerouting its steel to domestic projects and EU buyers. The move didn't make headlines. It made history. As Hamilton's mills roared back to life, Detroit's assembly lines slowed to a crawl. American automakers scrambled, costs ballooned, layoffs loomed, all while Canada said almost nothing. How do you retaliate against tariffs without saying a word and still bring an industrial giant to its knees? For decades, steel was the hidden spine of US-Canada trade. Canadian mills in cities like Hamilton, Ontario, supplied raw and semi-finished steel to Detroit's auto plants, Chicago's construction sites, and aerospace facilities across the Midwest. The US, in turn, sold machinery, chemicals, and finished products back to Canadian manufacturers. The relationship wasn't just efficient, it was symbiotic. Under NAFTA and later CUSMA, steel flowed freely across the border. Canadian producers like Stelco and Dofasco operated in near lockstep with US partners, often scheduling deliveries just in time to meet Detroit's tight assembly deadlines. With low-carbon hydroelectric power and modern infrastructure, Canada became one of the most reliable and clean steel suppliers in North America. That trust began to fracture in early 2025. Citing national security and the need to protect American workers, the Trump administration raised tariffs on imported steel and aluminum from 25% to 50%, with a specific emphasis on Canadian metals. It was the second major escalation in under a decade. But this time, there was no carve-out, no back-channel diplomacy. Ottawa didn't erupt. Instead, it adapted. In June 2025, Canada implemented a new national steel policy that restricted exports until domestic demand was fully met, prioritizing public infrastructure, clean energy, and military procurement. Overnight, export volumes to the US began to fall. Steel, once destined for Detroit, now stayed home or shipped to Europe, where Canadian green steel qualified under EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. There were no loud declarations, no dramatic WTO battles, just a quiet reordering of supply and a signal Canada was no longer playing the same game. The US action, protectionism reloaded. On February 10, 2025, the Trump administration made good on a campaign promise, raised tariffs on imported steel and aluminum to 50%, with Canada named explicitly. This move, justified under national security grounds via Section 232, was framed as necessary to revive American industry and stop foreign dumping. Canada's flooding our market, Trump said during a rally in Ohio. It's time to put American steel first. The US steel lobby applauded, but behind closed doors, many manufacturers flinched. For the automotive sector, especially in Detroit, the tariff meant instant chaos. Nearly 20% of the steel used by US automakers came from Canada, valued for its consistent quality, lower emissions, and proximity to assembly lines. By March, procurement officers at Ford, GM, and Stellantis began reporting price surges and delays. An internal GM memo, leaked to the press in April, warned that average vehicle costs could rise by $800 to $1,200 due to sourcing complications and domestic shortages. Analysts at IHS Markit predicted layoffs at stamping plants by Q3 if supply didn't stabilize. Construction firms fared no better. Infrastructure projects in the Midwest stalled as reinforced bar rebar and sheet steel became harder to secure. A Cleveland-based contractor told Reuters, "We used to get Canadian rebar in 2 days. Now we're waiting weeks and paying more." US steel producers celebrated short-term gains, but cracks showed fast. Domestic mills lacked the surge capacity to fill the void left by Canadian imports. Steel production in the US had been declining for years, with many mills running below capacity due to outdated furnaces and a shortage of skilled labor. Even national defense flagged concerns. The Pentagon, which sources high-grade aluminum and specialized steel for aerospace and naval projects, issued an internal warning about supply instability and cost overruns due to tariff-driven import volatility. Despite the warnings, the White House remained defiant. "American jobs will come home," Trump tweeted in May. "We don't need Canada's steel when we can make our own." But reality proved more complex. As the policy dragged on, layoffs began surfacing, not in steel mills, but in auto plants. In June, Stellantis announced it would idle a factory line in Michigan due to part shortages. Ford cut a shift in Kansas City. And parts suppliers in Indiana and Ohio began shedding jobs. The strategy, meant to punish Canada, was beginning to undermine America's own industrial base, with no relief in sight. Canada's response: silent leverage, strategic restructuring. Ottawa didn't retaliate with equal firepower. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada chose precision over provocation. Instead of issuing counter-tariffs or escalating trade rhetoric, Canada launched a strategic export recalibration plan, an elegant response that weaponized supply without breaking WTO rules. At the heart of the policy was one simple adjustment. Canada's steel would now be exported only after domestic needs were met. This domestic-first mandate, introduced in June 2025, was framed not as retaliation, but as nation-building, a focus on climate-resilient infrastructure, transit modernization, and defense procurement. The result? Canadian steel exports to the U.S. fell from 78% to 68% year over year, while total output remained steady. The message was subtle but clear. You can't penalize our steel and expect us to save your supply chains. Hamilton, long dubbed Steel City, saw a renaissance. Stelco reopened a dormant line. Dofasco, with help from federal subsidies, accelerated its transition to electric arc furnaces, EAFS, a cleaner, more flexible technology favored by ESG investors and European buyers. With the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, looming, Canadian steel suddenly had global appeal. It was low emissions, traceable, and aligned with environmental standards the US was struggling to meet. Canadian producers secured forward contracts with Germany, France, and South Korea, ensuring stability even as US orders faded. This industrial revival wasn't just economic, it was psychological. After years of being viewed as the junior partner in North American trade, Canada was asserting its autonomy through infrastructure, not ideology. Meanwhile, domestic projects gained momentum. High-speed rail in Quebec, green buildings in Vancouver, military retrofits using homegrown steel. Ottawa positioned the policy as climate strategy, but it was also quiet resilience, and it worked. While Detroit was scrambling, Hamilton was humming. The legal brilliance lay in WTO compliance. By not banning exports or subsidizing selectively, Canada's policy remained airtight. Washington had no legal grounds to challenge it. "We've structured everything within WTO norms," said a spokesperson for Carney's office. "We're not breaking rules. We're just prioritizing Canadians," international observers noticed. South Korea, facing its own steel tariff negotiations with Washington, cited Canada's strategy as a model for soft power trade resilience. Seoul even launched talks to co-invest in Canadian EAF projects. By August, Canada had turned Trump's tariffs into a catalyst, not through retaliation, but through redefinition. It wasn't just about protecting steel, it was about elevating it. The stalemate. Two systems, one strain. By late summer 2025, the US-Canada steel conflict had no resolution, only divergence. In Washington, officials remained dug in. The administration painted the Canadian export drop as proof that tariffs were working. "We're forcing them to keep their steel," one senior aide told Axios. "That's a win." But on the ground, American manufacturers told a different story. Prices were up, delivery times unreliable, layoffs growing, U.S. steel mills couldn't expand fast enough, and those that did often lacked the low-emission standards that modern buyers demanded. Canada, by contrast, had stabilized. It wasn't just exporting less, it was exporting better. Green steel, premium grade, strategic shipments. Hamilton's mills were full, European ports were open. The two nations, once codependent industrial allies, were now operating on different logics, one leaning into nationalism and short-term control, the other investing in standards, sustainability, and global credibility. No one declared a trade war. But the fracture was real and growing deeper with every missed shipment and silent furnace. Impact on Canada. Hamilton's transformation, but not without pain. At first glance, Hamilton appears to be a comeback story. The once struggling Ontario city, long dependent on its aging steel mills, found new life in 2025. As Ottawa's domestic-first policy took effect, demand for Canadian steel surged. Stelco, which had faced repeated shutdowns over the past decade, reopened blast furnaces and hired over 800 new workers by July. Dofasco ramped up construction on electric arc furnace facilities, fast-tracked with federal green subsidies. The jobs came fast, but so did the stress. New employees were rushed through training. Overtime hours soared. Local roads clogged with trucks as new supply chains were stitched together. Hamilton's City Council reported a 38% spike in industrial water and energy consumption, pushing aging infrastructure to the brink. Meanwhile, smaller suppliers struggled to keep pace. Fabrication shops in the Niagara region, dependent on predictable U.S. contracts, found themselves shut out of lucrative federal projects that now required ESG certifications they couldn't yet meet. "We have Canadian steel," one owner told the Globe and Mail, "but not the government connections or carbon audits to bid on anything." Prices rose too. Without U.S. volume to balance production, Canadian consumers saw rebar and sheet steel climb 18 to 22% in Q3 alone. Developers in Toronto delayed projects. Renovation companies in Ottawa scaled back commitments. The policy may have favored infrastructure giants, but it left small firms squeezed by higher costs and tighter supply. Even within Hamilton, inequality widened. New hires at Stelco celebrated union wages, while legacy contractors saw hours cut. Restaurants boomed near the plant gates, while old industrial districts remained neglected. In short, the steel boom was real, but uneven. It lifted Hamilton's skyline, but also deepened divides between who won and who merely endured. The revival was strategic, but it came with human complexity Canada couldn't ignore. Blowback on the U.S., Detroit's slow breakdown. If Hamilton hummed with renewal, Detroit groaned under pressure. Once the proud heart of American manufacturing, Detroit had long relied on a seamless North American supply chain. But by summer 2025, that chain was cracking, and it started with steel. The 50% tariffs on Canadian metals, combined with Canada's phased export policy, created a double bind for automakers. At Ford's Rouge plant, engineers faced a cascade of disruptions. Chassis parts were delayed. Sheet steel deliveries missed their windows. The company's internal documents showed material costs for EV production rising 12%, eating into profit margins already squeezed by inflation and competition. In June, Ford laid off 400 temporary workers at its Michigan plant. Stellantis followed with furloughs in Toledo. Local suppliers, like stamping shops and seat manufacturers, reported falling orders and ballooning inventory. For the average American worker, this wasn't a macroeconomic debate. It was a pink slip, and the pain rippled outward. Detroit's city budget, heavily reliant on income taxes from manufacturing jobs, faced an unexpected shortfall. Public services were quietly trimmed. Bus routes reduced. Library hours shortened. Local officials pleaded with Washington for relief, but received only political talking points. Worse, the problem wasn't just Canada. It was inflexibility. U.S. steelmakers couldn't fill the gap. Many lacked the environmental certifications required for modern vehicle manufacturing, especially in EVs. European buyers demanded low-emission sourcing, and the U.S. steel supply, still dominated by coal-fired furnaces, fell short. Ironically, As Detroit struggled to meet EV demand, Canadian suppliers began exporting green steel to South Korea and Germany, markets once dominated by U.S. output. To many in Detroit, it felt like watching the future pass them by. "We were promised protection," said one laid-off worker. "All we got was isolation." The tariffs were designed to defend American steel. Instead, they left the country's auto capital stranded, without the metal it needed to move forward. The U.S. tried to flex economic muscle. Canada chose quiet recalibration. Now both nations stand at a tense impasse. Industries disrupted, communities divided, and trust quietly eroded beneath the surface. Hamilton rebuilt with strategy. Detroit stalled in silence. Jobs have shifted, supply chains reshaped, and the once fluid border has become a fault line of friction and uncertainty. Trade was never just about materials. It was about movement, reliability, and shared vision. And that vision now feels fragmented. No missiles were launched, no lawsuits were filed. But the cost of this trade war is measured not in headlines, but in the daily realities of factory floors, empty order books, and the quiet resentment of neighbors turned competitors. In the race to define the future, will North America win together or lose everything trying to go it alone? You're American or Canadian? What's your take? Share your story and your view in the comments below.